Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us for day one of the 2021 AASHTO Virtual Washington Briefing. My name is Rebecca Anger, Program Specialist for Policy and Government Relations at AASHTO. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us for day one of the 2021 AASHTO Virtual Washington Briefing. For both the my name is Rebecca Anger, Program Specialist for Policy and Government Relations at AASHTO. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us for day one of the 2021 AASHTO Virtual Washington Briefing. For both the transportation and forum, committee participants will be muted upon entry, but can interact during the meeting in two ways. First, by raising your hand using the blue icon at the bottom of the participants box, after which you will be called on and can unmute to speak. Second, by typing your questions or comments into the chat panel. Both menus can be opened from buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screens. All other attendees can watch the meeting through YouTube Live. Access links for each committee meeting are located in the agenda email containing session links for all registered attendees of this year's briefing. In the YouTube Live platform, a video screen will broadcast the corresponding committee meeting. And on YouTube Live, you're welcome to use the comments function, but we will not be taking any questions from outside the committees. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Wilson, AASHTO's Vice President, Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and Chair of the AASHTO Transportation Policy Forum.
Thank you, Rebecca. First, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone for attending this meeting of the AASHTO Transportation Policy Forum. This actually kicks off this year's edition, a virtual edition of the AASHTO Washington Briefing. I'm happy to tell you it's a warm welcome because the cold front that we just had in Louisiana has now vacated and has moved on to elsewhere, and things are slowly getting back to normal, but we're excited that you've taken the time to join us. I've been Secretary of the Department of Transportation since 2016, and I am most enthusiastic and excited about where things are, particularly as I get to serve as Vice President of this esteemed body of state DOTs through AASHTO. And as Vice President, I also chair the Transportation Policy Forum. As we have done in the past since creating the forum with the new structure, this takes place at our annual meeting, and we have lots of really interesting policy topics to discover and discuss and to dialogue about. And most importantly, when we have a new administration, it does give us a chance to be rejuvenated with the discussions that sometimes become routine for us. So I've been around AASHTO since 2005, and it seems like there's always a conversation about reauthorization, but it takes on a new meaning when you have new leadership and other folks across the table from you. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to do this. I'd like to acknowledge a great deal of support and work from our private sectors and our partners to help make this happen for this year's Washington Briefing. All of our association meetings and conferences this year have been different and unique, in large part because of COVID and how we've had to redirect and rework our agendas. But one thread that's been consistent and valuable, and that's is our partners. We can't do the work that we do and bring the platforms and the discussion topics we do to you without those folks. So let's take a moment to acknowledge and recognize our premier sponsors. We've got AECOM, Bentley Systems, HNTB, Jacobs, and WSP. All of them are premier sponsors and have been loyal supporters of AASHTO, not just in person, but virtually. We also have our capital sponsors, and they are the Amazon American Concrete Pipe Association, HDR, and Autodesk. Thank you all for being supporters as well. And for all of our sponsors and supporters, we know that you have a choice of where you send your dollars, and we appreciate what you do for AASHTO. For this particular Washington briefing, we have gold ticket sponsors, and we've been innovative in how we recognize them. So we've got some gold ticket sponsors that we'd like to acknowledge as well. Transurban is our single gold ticket sponsor this year, and we have silver level sponsors, CDM Smith, Michael Baker, and Trans Systems. Thank you all also for your support of the nation's DOTs. Not only do you work with us on delivering projects and transportation issues and initiatives, you help us do a much better job of coordinating and sharing those best practices like we're doing at the Transportation Policy Forum. So I also have the opportunity to introduce to many of you a familiar face, someone that I've known since I've been around transportation, and that is Mr. Bert Tysico. Bert is also this year's vice chairman, and he is the second official vice chair of TPF as Lynn Zanto moved on to brighter and greener pastures. So I'd like to congratulate Bert for his tenured service, not only to his state DOT, but to the nation through his AASHTO work. And so our president, Victoria Sheehan, has saw fit to appoint Bert. He is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Program Support at the North Carolina DOT, and he's going to be our AASHTO Vice President for the Transportation Policy Forum. In addition to his longstanding contributions to AASHTO, Bert has worked for decades in transportation planning, modeling, programming, funding, revenue forecasts, cash management, and of course, something that's dear to each of us, federal and state policy. Bert is a native of South America with an undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering from the North Carolina State University. And he's also a graduate of the UNC School of Government, along with holding a license as a professional engineer, far more qualified than I am for many things. Bert has served as the past AASHTO's very own management fellow, and has also served on TRB committees in economics, revenue, and finance, and the board of advisors of the Eno Center for Transportation. Congratulations, Bert, on your key leadership appointment. I look forward to working with you. You will fill a very critical role from a continuity standpoint of what we do. And so, Bert, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sean Wilson, and thank you for that kind introduction. I'd like to join the chair in welcoming everybody to this year's AASHTO briefing and echo everything that he has said. To all of my colleagues in AASHTO, thank you so much for your notes of support. I am very privileged, humbled, and I hope to live in the footsteps of Lynn Santos. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Bert. So we got a couple of reminders that we'd like to share with those who are members of the forum. We've provided some materials that have been sent to you on email that will make this meeting, I think, go much more effective. First, we have what we call to do this and do that tip sheet. And the fiscal note that is intended to guide congressional outreach. Obviously, we're not able to go over to Capitol Hill this year as we would normally do after these discussions and provide new and great information from the Washington briefing, but it doesn't have to compromise our ability to work with state DOTs to connect with their congressional delegations. So, go out and visit, make phone calls, do it the old-fashioned way. Go sit in the offices of your congressional staff. We know they all have offices back home. So take advantage of this opportunity to meet with them as best you can to share these ideas. And we have that guidance for you in your packet. We've also provided the AASHTO Policy and Government Relations team. They've set up a number of one-on-one consultations with our state DOTs over the last month. They've been tremendously successful thus far. We've had about 10 of them. We want to make sure that you and your states actually take advantage of this, because this is going to be a way for us to help develop better agenda items and topical support teams and support work that we can help you achieve some of your goals as well. And as the full TPF meetings, we focus on a number of national policies, and we've provided some of that to you, issues that are of common interest to each of our states. This is a great opportunity to talk about your state-specific policy priorities with the AASHTO team and how we can amplify that message on the Hill. So take advantage of looking at all of those resources. We've got the chat structure and all of those other items for folks on this forum, and we do look forward to lots of engaged discussion. And so with that said, why don't we have Rebecca proceed to call the roll so that we can get to our agenda.
All right. Well, when I call your state, please respond with your name. Let's start with Alabama.
Yes, Ed Austin.
Alaska.
Carolyn Morehouse.
Arizona. Arkansas. California. Colorado.
Amy Grimm is here, and my last name only has one M.
My apologies. I'll correct
It's okay.
that as soon as we're done here. Connecticut,
Pam Staccato here.
Delaware,
Dante Hastings.
DC, Florida, Georgia,
Mike Dober.
Hawaii,
Aloha, Ed Sniffen here.
Idaho,
Matt Moore.
Illinois,
Doug House.
Indiana, Iowa,
Stu Anderson.
Kansas,
Joel Skelly.
Kentucky,
Mike Hancock.
Louisiana,
Eric Calabota.
Maine, Maryland,
Greg Slater.
Massachusetts, Michigan,
Laura Mester.
Minnesota,
Nancy Dobbenberger.
Mississippi, Missouri,
Ed Hassinger.
Montana,
Carol Strizich.
Nebraska,
Lynn Heaton.
Nevada,
Sandra Rosenberg.
New Hampshire,
Bill Cass.
New Jersey,
Mike Russo.
New Mexico,
Tamara Haas.
New York, North Carolina,
Art Psycho.
North Dakota, Ohio,
Hi, it's Tim Hill.
Oklahoma, Oregon,
Trevor Sleeman.
Pennsylvania,
Natasha Fackler.
Rhode Island,
Pam Cotter.
South Carolina, South Dakota,
Good afternoon, Joel Junt.
good afternoon, Tennessee,
Paul Diggs.
Texas,
Mark Williams.
Utah, Vermont,
Michelle Boomhauer.
Virginia,
Nick Donahue.
Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin,
Joshua Reed.
and Wyoming.
John Davis for Wyoming.
If I missed anyone, or if anybody signed in while I was reading, could you please state your name and state now?
Linda Hull with Utah.
Thank you.
Jennifer Brickett with Maine DOT.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think I will turn it back over to our chair, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that roll call. So we appreciate, as we said, everyone signing on and participating. You sound pretty clear. You understand all the protocol for these meetings. So at this point, we'll entertain a motion. And of course, in any motion or second, please state your name so that we aren't scanning the screen to look at all of the virtual faces. But we sent out the minutes from the last TPF meeting back in November. And the final draft was sent to you in advance of this meeting. So is there a motion to adopt the minutes from that November 12th meeting?
Tamara Haas. New Mexico, motion to approve.
Laura Mester, Michigan, second.
All right, thank you, Laura and others for motioning that. Is there any Are there any questions on readiness regarding that motion and approving the minutes? Hearing none and seeing no clarifications, all those in favor of adopting the minutes say aye.
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 And we will give those who are opposed to adopting the minutes an opportunity to say nay.
This is Nick Donahue from Virginia. I don't want to say no. I just want to abstain. I wasn't here for that meeting.
Thank you. And I was going to call for any abstentions other than the one stated abstention.
Lynn Heaton, abstain.
All right, 2 abstentions, no nays and several yays. So the motion to approve the minutes is now adopted. So thank you all for that. And we appreciate you all declaring, if you were not a part of that meeting, to validate it for that abstention. And we will continue to do that as we take up motion. So as we said before, we have lots of really interesting discussions to talk about from a policy perspective. And we've got a number of people who are familiar faces to this forum to do the deep dive and to talk about these policies and how it might relate to us. And so before we turn it over to AASHTO staff for presentations and discussion, we'd like to remind you that your meeting materials were sent to you, and there's an updated review of the AASHTO review of the House Surface Transportation Bill from last summer, HR 2 and/or the Move Forward Act, if that's how you're familiar with it. The AASHTO team has spent the last several months taking another look at HR 2 to identify policy areas of agreement and things we might have missed, and also to point out areas that would benefit from further discussions with DOTs as we've evolved in this conversation. A key message for Capitol Hill throughout this discussion is that DOTs can help make these policy provisions that are aligned with AASHTO's reauthorization recommendations as executable and implementable as possible. The last thing that we want to do is add more confusion or uncertainty in what we have to deliver, because our country is depending on us to make sure that we have a sound transportation system, and it starts in many respects with the policies that they pass. So given the unparalleled practical experience that we have at DOTs and what we do and what we know, this is the ideal forum to have some of those discussions and to advance back to our AASHTO staff as we talk about ways to communicate these improvements. There's an updated review of HR 2 that can guide our thinking and emerging policy areas that further supplement what we at the board level of AASHTO adopted for our 2019 policies as it relates to reauthorization. And so to lead that discussion, we've got June Lee, Susan Howard, and the familiar face of Kathy Ruffalo from AASHTO's policy team. They will provide an update on what's been happening in DC and to get our guidance. And so again, while this is an exchange and an opportunity for them to present for us, we do want to provide them as much feedback as we possibly can to best position AASHTO for successful policy outcomes. First, we're going to have Susan Howard, the AASHTO Program Director for Transportation and Finance, and she'll provide an update on the return or the potential return of earmarks to Congress that's expected in fiscal year 2022. And then after we talk about earmarks, Susan will then provide an overview of budget reconciliation, which is a process that many have heard a lot about for the past few months. And it's something that we've not talked about necessarily on the larger scale for AASHTO, but she's going to give us a little bit of what that means and how that will work. And then she will also focus on the legislative mechanics of reconciliation as part of her presentation. And so that should be a pretty interesting discussion from Susan. And after that discussion with Susan, which we think will last about 20 minutes, we'll then hear from Jung Lee, our Director of Policy and Government Relations, on how reconciliation is being used for COVID relief right now. So it'll give us an idea of how that might turn out for infrastructure. Possibly as we look at this package following the COVID relief, infrastructure, we believe and we hope, is next on the policy agenda and platform for the country. And then following June, that will also be about a 20-minute discussion. We'll then hear from Kathy Ruffalo on our policy considerations for AASHTO regarding direct federal funding of localities and the design of discretionary grant programs. Many of you saw the InfraGrant come out with some pretty interesting changes. And I know from talking to other secretaries, we're always talking about how we can better collaborate with local governments. And I think we'll see that take a new level of leadership at the USDOT with who's now Secretary Pete, former Mayor Pete, understanding what his priorities are and that of the team he has assembled. So over that 20-minute time, we'll have Kathy give us that. Then we'll wrap up our policy discussions by identifying next steps and entertaining any questions that you all might have. So we'll follow in that order if it's okay with the group. And so let's turn it over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all this afternoon. I've been asked to provide a couple of updates. First on earmarking and what we might be seeing coming down the pike. A little bit of a qualifier. I think the reason I was tapped to talk about earmarks is that I spent a big chunk of my professional career working on earmarks, first for a member of the House Appropriations Committee and then for North Carolina DOT, where I tried to, I guess, work with our local jurisdictions to make earmarking as good as it could be for state DOTs. So maybe this is part of my atonement for being part of the problem and not part of the solution for so many years. I'll take it and look forward to your insights as we get to some discussion about how we can help inform the debate. But I think now with Democrats in control of both the House and Senate and the current Congress, the notion of bringing back earmarking is gaining quite a bit of steam. Democrats have long discussed a more transparent and limited form of earmarking from what we had before to allow members to direct funds to specific projects in their communities. And this has been in the context of both appropriations and authorization, but I think the most kind of robust discussion has been on the appropriations side. So the new chair of the House Appropriations Committee, Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, is considering the parameters of a reformed earmarking process. On the authorizing side, House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chair Peter DeFazio has also indicated he's supportive of bringing them back. But meanwhile, in the Senate, the Republican conference banned earmarks, I believe, probably about 9 or 10 years ago. So that's written into their own rules that they do not earmark. That, of course, could change if the tides seem to be shifting. And Senate Democrats have sort of been taking a wait and see approach, although just earlier today, Senator Durbin from Illinois, who's the key in the leadership in the Senate, indicated that he thought that earmarking might be key to a more bipartisan approach to infrastructure. So there's certainly some interest in how bringing back earmarks might help move along legislation related to transportation and infrastructure. So to review some of the reforms that we've heard being considered specifically for transportation earmarks. And again, transportation earmarks are unique in the sense that we're dealing with contract authority and money that would already be going to states, and carving out specific earmarks for local projects is disruptive and detrimental to that process. But we're really looking, I think Congress is looking at earmarking across the board, but certainly transportation is a high focus because of the number of earmarks we had in the past on both reauthorization bills and the annual appropriations process. So some of the things that are being talked about specifically in the transportation context are making sure that projects are included in either the STIP or the metropolitan areas TIP, limiting or capping the total funding for earmarks to a certain percentage. I've heard 1% of discretionary spending been talked about. Making sure that earmarking can't be done out of contract authority. And then there's been some talk about converting the annual discretionary supplemental appropriations that have been part of the transportation appropriations bill for the last 3 or 4 years. As you'll recall, there's been this sort of discretionary pot of funding that's been sort of new since about 2018. So one idea has been like, can we convert that, which is general funded funding, can we convert that pot to an earmarkable account? Meaning that would be where we draw down those funds for earmarks directly. You all are well aware that state DOTs have long opposed earmarking because of the way it cuts into apportioned funds that states would already receive. And in addition, we've had issues with funds sitting idle because a local sponsor is unable to deliver them. And as many of you are aware, for the past few years, there's been a process of repurposing earmarks where state DOTs were allowed to use those unspent earmarks on projects that met certain criteria. A close in geographical location was one of the particular criteria. So you all have been in the earmarking business, even if you didn't realize it, for the past few years, because you've been spending time doing the repurposing, which I believe that process is about to draw to a close. But certainly if Congress decides to bring back earmarks again, that would open up a whole new set of challenges for us. So the question that we're hoping to get some feedback from you all today is on if Congress is interested in reviving earmarking, how can the process be structured to help or at least do no harm to state DOTs? Some of the policy ideas I've mentioned earlier, I think are ones that we could have some common agreement around, but we'd love to get a little bit more feedback from you all about that process and what your biggest concerns would be going into this again, and how we might structure some guardrails to improve the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm trying to get my video to start there. Thank you for that. So you've really set the stage for a healthy backlog discussion, if you will, of earmarks and how we could use them. The most important thing I think you said was it'd be interesting to hear from folks around the country, how might we proceed with this? We've talked about this for some time and that repurposing process. How might we proceed in a way to do no harm and to be effective in using this as a tool? And so let's open the floor for discussion to other members. Anyone would like to speak up? I don't have a full view of everybody on the screen just yet, but if you raise your hand or want to be recognized, let me know.
This is Nick Donahue with Virginia.
Hello, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing well. I think one comment I would add to some of the points that Ms. Howard raised is one of the issues we saw in the past was getting a less than 5% of funding for a project. So when you talked about some of the funds that sat idle, I don't think our experience in Virginia was that the funds that sat idle were because our locals kind of failed to deliver a project. It was more that we got, say, $5 million for a project that cost $800 million. And so the amount of funding that was provided was just kind of drastically out of line with the cost of the improvement that was contemplated. And I'm sure, folks who talk about how segmentation or other things kind of, could have taken place or stuff of that nature. But I would just say, as we're thinking about potential, guardrails, some sort of concept that the project for which it has received, for which funding is being earmarked, like there's either other funding identified or it provides X percentage, which of the funding of a project. Because I think in my preferred outcome, if this is going to happen, it would be to complete funding kind of gaps on existing projects that have been identified that simply don't have full funding at the moment. But I do know that if you looked at many of our, I think you called them unused earmarks, or the ones that were kind of hanging around, I think like in the most extreme example, I think we had $20 million for a project that was in the billions. And so that clearly is, I don't think is a great outcome, because the money sits there and, we couldn't move forward just because of the higher cost of the product, despite having the earmark in hand. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And Alaska has concurred with your comments, and we'd like to remind you, as we talk a little bit about broadband, we've asked folks to maybe turn off their cameras when they're not speaking, but please feel free, since we're on YouTube Live, to turn your cameras on when you ask questions. So thank you for that comment, Nick. I appreciate that. And, in addition to considering the financial implications, one of the things that we've talked about here in Louisiana and talked to other secretaries about is making sure that a project is within the plan and that the project is actually ready for the amount of the value of the earmark, so that we aren't chasing projects that aren't consistent with where states perhaps have used their priorities. So we'd like to get Ed Hassinger next, who's from Missouri. Ed?
Yeah, I think our experience really has been in the past that, of course, we'd prefer above the line earmarks. So it's, over the formula. And then I think we agree that, getting $1 million for a $20 million project doesn't help us in informing our congressional delegation that if you really want to see something happen, you need to kind of work with us. And I think that's important that they know our priorities. So they earmark stuff that can be put in play quickly. And that benefits them as well as us so that we can make some progress. Those have been our experiences in the earmark days.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed, for that. Nebraska concurs with you, and I'll share those chat comments as they pop up. Let's go to Joel in South Dakota.
Thank you, Sean. Definitely agree with what's been discussed already. Some of the projects that we had for earmarks and some of the negative aspects of those was local governments put in requested earmarks and those were funded, and they really didn't understand the federal process and all of the things that it takes to deliver those projects. So we would recommend that there's some methodology to ensure that from an administrative standpoint, those folks that are, requesting earmarks, that they have those tools in place in order to deliver the projects. We still have one repurposed earmark that we're still working on, and it's been 12 years ago. So that aspect, and for the locals, they normally don't work in the federal side, at least in South Dakota. So it's a lot of hoops that they didn't understand. For them, it was, we're going to get a check and then we're going to go do our project. Well, not realizing what all it takes, we would recommend that there be some methodology in place in order for those projects to be delivered with the local government. So thank you.
So Joel and or Ed, let me just lightly put you on the spot and ask a question from an executive standpoint. Would it be problematic, either of you think, for a state to have to concur with an earmark before it's officially included? Or I see comments about it being in the STIP and the TIP. That might work well for projects that are within an MPO, but how would that translate locally if we asked or suggested that there be some concurrence from a state before it advanced to some other level of delivery as an earmark?
And I think that's a great aspect. Those earmarks that I'm thinking of, we had no idea that they were actually even put in, let alone once they got awarded, it was a big surprise. So if there's some sort of a collaborative effort from a statewide perspective to know what all of these are and allow at least us to have some opportunity to comment on that, that would be wonderful.
Ed, let me come back to you since you initiated that discussion. Any comments from you?
I think it would be helpful, but I'm not sure it's realistic. I think having the relationship with your congressional delegation is probably the best way to do that. I think the ones that are surprises are more of those local projects that really don't have the background, and sometimes they get lobbied for at the local level without understanding what it really takes. Those are the ones that in the past I think we've had the most problem with, not really the state system project.
Well, thank you for that. A couple of folks made comments that earmarks would be great if they were in the TIP and the STIP already. And I think Michelle from a small state, Vermont, would have difficulty with the provisions which would only complete funding for a particular project. So Michelle, would you like to expound on that a little bit?
Sure. So as a small state, our revenue structure is such that, we don't have tolling, we don't have a large amount of general fund. Our transportation fund revenues really are strictly dedicated to the program and often are, barely enough to meet the match requirements for drawing down all of our federal funds. And so to have an earmark program only fill a gap on an existing project really wouldn't be helpful for us, because we need to sort of find a way to grow the program. So I would, we would want to be able to see more flexibility in that regard.
Thank you, Michelle. This is a good time to point out when we talked earlier about making sure you have a relationship with your congressional delegation, here's an example of where that's going to become extremely important if this proceeds, to have an open dialogue before we get these surprises in there. So it puts the onus back on us as a state agency or as professionals in this business to be proactively engaged in the discussion and knowing what's happening around our state. I'm going to go to the person whose office is right next to mine, Dr. Eric Calavoda from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The 2 points I want to make. One is that we need an exemption from the 10-year payback rule on earmarks. We've gotten caught by that numerous times because they're underfunded and you're getting pressure to move forward with the project. So you go as far as the money will take you. Nothing ever happens with the project. And then if you're short on match, which many states are, then you're having to pay this money back with 100% state funds. Even if you have an agreement with a local sponsor, getting money out of them is like squeezing blood out of a turnip. You're not going to get it. So it's going to fall back on the states again. So that's one point. The second point is the earmarks really need to be consistent with your state plan or metropolitan plan. They should not contradict that. If you're set in a certain direction for your state programmatically, same with the metropolitan area, then Congress should not come in and earmark projects which are in conflict with that. So those are the 2 comments I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Let me go to this gentleman's office isn't next door, but his state certainly is. And we work very well with the state of Texas. And thank you all for cleaning a short stretch of Louisiana's road from ice and snow when we couldn't get to it. Let me go to Mark Williams over in Texas.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, we're very happy to be out of the winter weather that we had over the last week. It's enough to hold us for a while. I agree with all the comments that were made. I want to kind of go back to the comment or the topic that you raised about working potentially with Congress to get some sort of a letter or a certification or approval from the U.S. DOTs, before earmarks are made. And, I believe that probably would be a bit of a tall order, but I don't know that it's entirely unprecedented. I think both your state and my state have experience with interstate designations that tend to be a favorite of congressional members from time to time, and they will file bills designated one route or another as an interstate. And what I have certainly seen over the past several years, and I think this is kind of an informal process that House leadership probably holds to, but they have routinely come back to the states and asked us for a letter or some sort of statement that would designate whether or not we are prepared to move forward with that if Congress was to do an interstate designation on a particular route. So at least, there is some precedent that we might be able to point to in having that established where there's at least a check. And I do agree with what Eric talked about making sure these things are in some adopted plan, particularly a federal plan or program. So I think there's a way to get to a good program. Above the line would be good as well. But there's some tools and mechanisms out there that I think would work well to make sure that we're in alignment with Congress if they go the earmark route.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Linda Hall wanted to stress that would be great if environmental was already done unless it was a category exclusion. And for the sake of time, I'll also acknowledge that I got an amen out of my friend Mike Hancock. He said that we must cultivate the relationship with our delegation and have them focus on projects that are already in the STIP. They could pick a winner and we would get funding assistance in delivering a project. And so amen to that, Mike. I agree with you and I agree with all the comments. And the hard part about being the chairman of this group is you have to end conversation as we have these 20-minute sessions. So we will continue this dialogue electronically. If you have other comments or questions that you'd like to give us as it relates to earmarks. But in this last minute, I would suggest just as food for thought, not necessarily in a directive in any way, think about if we establish real priorities for the country in terms of interstates, or if it was really around safety, or if it was around public works. I mean, just whatever it is, come up with that priority and not scattershot these ideas. And so in closing, I would offer that comment that as a secretary, I would like to really focus on the problems at hand. And we all know there's a huge issue with interstate. What if we specified with earmarks a particular issue that as a country we've identified? So thank you all for that discussion. And we are capturing all of your comments in the chat box, as well as other email communications that go on, because it's fast and furious. I'm seeing lots of things come across, which is really, really healthy. All right, so for the next 20-minute slot, let's go on over to Jung and have him engage in his discussion. So Jung?
Before I start, Susan also wanted to provide an update on the reconciliation and the mechanics behind it.
Okay, thank you for catching that. I'm playing catch up here. Susan, you want to address the reconciliation piece?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for the wonderful comments and feedback. I look forward to digging in deeper to some of the things that came in the chat. This has been really, really helpful, and I think will assist us a lot as we communicate with congressional leaders on this topic. So I've been asked to give a brief overview of how the budget reconciliation process works and how it's being used to advance a $1.9 trillion COVID relief and economic stimulus bill. We wanted to touch a little bit on this because, again, I think budget reconciliation is such a specific and limitedly used process, but it's certainly getting a lot of attention right now because of its use to advance these COVID relief measures. And there's also talk about using it further down the road for infrastructure. So we're going to kind of go through how it works and what it is. So hopefully you'll be able to have a little bit more awareness of why we're talking about it, what it even means. So budget reconciliation is a process that allows for expedited consideration of certain tax, spending, and debt limit legislation. In the Senate, reconciliation bills are not subject to filibuster, and the scope of amendments is limited. So this allows for a fast tracking process through the Senate, where it normally is very difficult, as you're all aware, to get anything past the 60 vote threshold. So again, budget reconciliation kind of puts things on a expedited fast track, and you avoid some of the procedural hurdles to passing legislation. It's not necessarily particularly well known or often used, as I mentioned. It can only be done once per federal budget cycle. And since 1980, 21 budget reconciliation measures have been enacted. So it doesn't happen every year. It most recently happened in 2017 to pass tax reform legislation. So the process is multi-step, and I want to try to provide a brief overview of the mechanics and give you a little bit of an update on where things stand currently. In order to begin the process, both the House and Senate have to agree on a budget resolution. And in order to trigger the reconciliation process, that budget resolution has to include what are known as reconciliation directives to House and Senate committees that basically give them a dollar amount and a deadline to report legislative language making fiscal changes to the programs within their jurisdiction over a 10-year budget window. So each committee writes their bill that meets those specifications, sends it on to the House or Senate Budget Committee. All of those various bills from committees get bundled together and moved to the Rules Committee and then to the floor. And so I want to talk specifically about how that process is being used currently to provide transportation-related relief. And again, keep in mind that what we're talking about here primarily is the House, because the House has moved first. The House Budget Committee actually approved last night their big reconciliation package, and it'll probably be on the floor later this week. And so where that comes in with the transportation allocation has to do with the House T&I Committee, obviously. They got their instructions for reconciliation included $96 billion. Ultimately, they ended up allocating $42.5 billion of that for transportation programs, $30 billion for transit, $8 billion for airports, $1.5 billion for Amtrak, and $3 billion for aerospace manufacturing payroll support. There was also other committees of jurisdiction that had pieces of this, particularly House Government Oversight with the state and local aid piece, which I could talk about in a minute. So it's important to note about the package that came out of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that it was really pre-negotiated with the White House and the Senate. What you'll see in this reconciliation package almost mirrors exactly what the Biden administration had put forth as their priorities for the next COVID relief package. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of room for negotiation, or sort of the die was cast in a way. It's sort of a pre-made deal, so to speak. And there, as I mentioned, there's limited opportunities for amendments. So it's kind of run along a sort of preordained track in a way. So the $350 billion that was provided for by the House Committee on Oversight and Reform is that state and local aid that folks have been waiting for, that didn't get passed in the last COVID relief package back in December. It's roughly split 60-40 between state and local governments. And we can get into some of the details on that if folks are curious about the specific, allowable uses and how the money will be distributed. Now, looking at the Senate, it doesn't seem likely that the Senate is going to go through the extensive committee process that the House did. They'll probably just take up what the House passes later this week and stick their version on as an amendment. And again, where things get interesting and you start to hear a lot about voting procedure and the Byrd rule is on the Senate side. The rules around Senate debate and amendments to a budget reconciliation package are very prescriptive. You've probably heard the Byrd rule mentioned quite a few times, and that basically prohibits any budget reconciliation package from carrying what they call extraneous matters. And that means essentially any senator can block any provision that go beyond the very specific parameters of reconciliation, which is implementing budget changes. So spending and cutting. So revenue related things are allowable, but policy related matters are not really and are subject to the Byrd rule. So that's why we won't see a lot of policy come through this process, and we won't see reauthorization type measures. It really is about the overall spend out of the budget over a 10-year window. So we're increasing our budget spending or making cuts as has been used previously for budget reconciliation for doing tax cuts. There is limitations on debate on the Senate floor of 20 hours. And then there's sort of this process known as the vote-a-rama, where anybody can offer an amendment, but there's really no debate. So they just go churning through amendments. And you may hear more about that as we approach the Senate's consideration of the budget reconciliation packages. All sorts of interesting things get offered as amendments and either accepted or rejected based on the parameters of what's allowed in budget reconciliation. Now, we've already started to hear some talk about using this process again in a few months to focus on infrastructure, climate, and jobs. And so that might lead to the question of how is it possible to do two of these so quickly in succession? As I mentioned previously, reconciliation can only be done once per budget cycle. And since there was never a fiscal year 2021 budget resolution, what we're doing right now is basically tied to this overdue budget cycle. In the whole calendar year of 2020, there was never a budget resolution for fiscal year 2021. So now we're kind of doing it on the tail end of things here to get at the reconciliation goals and doing this COVID relief through that package. So it would be possible to do another round of budget reconciliation as part of the process for fiscal year 22, which begins, as you all know, on October 1st of 2021. So that's a lot of information, and maybe it's just clear as mud now, but I'm hoping that maybe that gives you a little bit of a parameter of why we're talking so much about budget reconciliation as a means to achieving other goals through the COVID relief package that the administration has put forth. And John will be talking a bit more about this, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. Thank you.
So thank you, Susan. We are going to take that as information only and not engage with questions, because it can be very dizzying, other than to know that we have a very capable staff at AASHTO to help process and guide some of these discussions for the organization. And so based on a time check, we're about 10 minutes behind. So we'll ask Jung and Susan to kind of split that so that we can stay on track for the rest of today's meetings. And remember, you can use the text as well as email after these meetings to have an ongoing conversation with the group. Make sure you reply to all so folks can be aware of questions or dialogue that you're trying to instigate. So with that, let me turn it over to Jung a second time for him to go into his portion of what we have to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. I think Susan did a great job providing you with the overview on how reconciliation works. And as part of kind of continuing that discussion, I wanted to, first of all, extend our thanks for your help in making the outreach again late last year to secure the $10 billion COVID relief. I've only heard from all of you that this has been really great help to every state DOT around the country. And I think our message really resonated with the lawmakers because our ask was based on sound data and analysis. And as I mentioned in the prior TPF communication, I want to once again emphasize that every state should really look to put these dollars to work as soon as possible. The obligation deadline, yes, it's September 30th, 2024. But given the urgency behind this request for federal assistance, it is definitely important for Congress and the administration to see that what they provided is used quickly. And looking at the status of COVID funds will be especially important for additional funding requests made in the future, not just on additional COVID relief, but on stimulus and reauthorization as well, that we'll cover for the rest of the policy discussion this afternoon. And you may have seen in the news, last year, the optics issue in terms of some of the slower spend outs, and we certainly want to avoid that. Also want to talk a little bit about the messaging distinction. So the state DOT backstop last year was couched on the fact that state DOTs were experiencing significant state transportation user fee revenue losses, especially during the peak of the stay-at-home orders. And we had asked you many, many times through the surveys on how such revenue losses were impacting state DOT responsibilities ranging from capital programs, system preservation, operations, maintenance, and administration, including payroll. And so in essence, it was really couched as the revenue backstop needed to immediately stabilize state DOT's fiscal baseline by preventing cuts in projects and jobs, not inducing additional investment. So this action was also important to preserve the core capabilities of all the state DOTs to be in a position to implement what will hopefully be a robust surface transportation bill. Yet throughout the discussions we've heard, especially I think from a lot of the media references, referring to COVID relief as quote unquote stimulus. And the difference between COVID relief based on revenue loss and a stimulus is really quite different, and conflating the terms, I think, have led to some confusion about what the COVID relief bill was trying to do. So, when you talk about the economic stimulus, it should really look to induce additional investment above the baseline to spur rebound and regrowth in jobs and economic activities. And it is in that second vein of a fiscal stimulus that we expect the next big legislation to be in after the current COVID relief package that Susan talked about is completed in the coming weeks. I also want to add that there have been a number of questions why AASHTO didn't voice a request to be part of the current COVID package like we did last year that led to the December 8th. So the COVID impact survey provided by you, the TPF members, in April and June of last year, and then again in January of this year, indicated that thankfully the impact of COVID revenue loss was not as horrific as initially estimated almost a year ago at this point. And accordingly, we adjusted the amount of COVID relief aid during this time. And it turns out that the $10 billion was about right on the nose to cover all of the fiscal 2020 state revenue losses and a portion of expected 2021 revenue losses as well. And of course, even with the 10 billion, that leaves about 18 billion in further revenue losses for the remainder of this federal fiscal year, plus the next two to follow. But the guidance we received from the AASHTO leadership was to look at making a big push for that stimulus bill that will follow again in just a matter of weeks. And it is conceivable that this next package could have a big capital investment portion, but also allow some flexibility to further cover for remaining COVID-related state DOT revenue losses. So I'd like to keep my presentation brief because I think there are some questions that our TPF leadership would like to raise on this topic.
Thank you, Jung. So we've got a couple of questions. I know Bert, as our vice chair, is typically tracking some of these discussions and will be. So let me turn it over to Bert and see if he would like to pose a question on this issue for you.
Famous words, I was muted. On that whole topic of, first and foremost, wanted to go back to earmark. I'm embarrassed to say I couldn't find the raise your hand up there. I agree with all the comments that were made in that regard, and certainly have a few other things, being the guy that's been around for decades, that I have experienced firsthand what the earmarking back in the 2000s was all about, like some of you have. The whole notion about this COVID relief funding, we as a state have certainly felt the impacts just like others have in terms of our drop in revenue. The big thing is here is, as we've gotten this new money, how I would be really interested to see have the different state DOTs have had issues on how to spend that money. And so that if there is another infusion of money, whether it's with a large reauthorization bill or with additional funding, what can we try to change to make it a little bit easier for us?
And I would just add that, in addition to the COVID relief dollars, if there is a massive infusion of capital-oriented dollars in the form of stimulus, which could perhaps be down payment to a robust long-term bill that we've talked about, how quickly can states, ramp up the capital programs? Again, it is in a way, aspirational thinking here, but there is a concern that if too much money is thrown out there too quickly, it can lead to inflated construction costs and obviously a corresponding kind of loss of value for the money. And then also that it could, some have said it could encourage substitution of state transportation dollars with federal dollars. And I think with COVID relief funding as well, it will be important to show how state DOTs can handle the next infusion of dollars.
Thank you, June. Patrick McKenna, our past president, wanted to stress for the public that the difference between stimulus and COVID relief are really important distinctions. And so the question I would pose to you, June, and perhaps if time allows, we can get some feedback from others. We've seen the infra application and some of the changes there. If what comes out of the proposed package or concept is focused on climate change or clean jobs, or even, social equity and things of that nature, somewhat a little different perhaps than maybe what all DOTs have uniformly or institutionally worked on. How do you envision DOTs responding to that and being engaged in that effort?
That's a great question, Mr. Chair. So, we are hearing that this infrastructure stimulus, fiscal stimulus, could really be focused on clean jobs and climate change as kind of the founding policy principles, but to guide the investments, including on infrastructure and transportation. But, as you've heard from Susan, budget reconciliation, if that is indeed the vehicle used again for fiscal 2022, you can only make limited, policy changes. So that tends to favor existing programs and doesn't allow for creation of new programs. So I think in that scenario, and it could be other scenarios that also should be considered, but under another reconciliation scenario, I think the question for the group here is, as you understand the current federal aid highway programs, how do you think some of the core formula programs can be aligned with the themes that I mentioned again on, climate change and clean jobs?
And that's a question for the membership, June?
Yes.
Yeah. So we do have a couple of questions, but if anyone would like to respond out of order to what June just asked, and we are watching time closely to make sure we get Kathy's to what June just said. Ron?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, a couple of comments on this great discussion. I would urge that any additional funds continue to be apportioned based on STP to give us the most flexibility that we possibly can have. But directly to respond to Jung's question, or the question that's raised about how can we, navigate forward, is that we also need to recognize that both federal highways, federal transit, and actually even if you want to throw in Federal Railroad Administration, have atrophied in some of their capacity to deliver bigger projects, as well as state DOTs. We need to figure out as part of a new package, not only how do we get the money obligated, but how do we, develop the resources to deliver those projects on the ground? And that's a piece that's missing from this conversation is the workforce development.
Thank you, Ron. Anyone else would like to chime in response to Jung's question before I go to Allison in Washington? Interesting points, Jung. I think, at the end of the day, we're going to need to continue this dialogue to help ourselves and each other kind of process through what this means, as well as engage in our discussions with our division offices and folks that you have an opportunity to talk to on the policy side with USDOT. But very, very good points you made and good questions. Let me go to Allison to try and get her question in. Allison?
Yeah, hi. Let's see, probably helpful if I uncovered my camera. Hi. And actually, this is just more of a comment to one of the earlier questions. We are still looking at a over $500 million shortfall just between now and June. So the money that we've gotten from the feds, while so appreciated, is frankly a down payment on the money we've lost. We are more dependent on state revenue than we are on federal revenue. So as far as we're concerned, more money to fill that gap would be really important for us. Preservation is our top priority, so we're able to pretty quickly spend money on preservation projects. We also have a federal court injunction related to fish passage that we would be looking to quickly spend, money on. We're raring to go. Conversely, to Jung's point about the ability to spend money quickly, for rural transit, our ferry system, we just got a whole lot of money and we are going to be working to spend it as fast as possible, but it might not be as fast as our congressional partners would prefer. And that's just a function of how much money we were given kind of unexpectedly. So, I think in some regards we are well prepared to get money out the door very quickly, maybe not on the big transformational capital projects. We do have some of those that have some shortfalls where we could spend the money quickly. But as far as maintaining our system, meeting our federal obligations, we are really well prepared. So I would hope that there will be both that backfill in addition to the stimulus conversation still coming. I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, Allison. And you make a good point, and it's in the chat box that Joe commented on in terms of the ability of our construction industry to deliver as quickly and how often and how quickly they can convert and ramp up to take on some of these tasks. We've got some other really interesting comments in the chat section I would call your attention to. There's another question in here from Joel about what are the current thoughts on the stimulus bill for transportation infrastructure coming out separately from reauthorization? And I would say, Joel, this is probably a topic that we'd want to have a dedicated conversation on because we can absorb all of Kathy's time talking about that. But that has been discussed at SMC and at the larger board level in terms of what that is. So let me make a comment or share with you something that was posted on the YouTube video from the Secretary of Ohio, my friend Jack Marchbanks. Dr. Jack Marchbanks says that Ohio DOT is investing in the state's share of CRSAA funding for previously delayed projects that will now go to construction this calendar year, that they still have projects waiting on funding. And so clearly there's a tremendous need. That's a huge takeaway, not just for Ohio, but for all states, I think, in terms of what's left to be done and what we can do. Jung, any other following and closing comments from you? I'm looking at the time and want to make sure that we get an opportunity to hear from Kathy, and then we will open it up for general questions if we have time left. Any closing comments, Jung?
The only closing comment is that we are crunching kind of the numbers again, like we did with COVID analysis to get the national COVID relief needs for state DOTs. We're now kind of expanding a similar study, but looking at the longer term reauthorization needs and how the front end of that amount could potentially be tailored or depending on how the infrastructure package discussion shapes up. So please stay tuned for more information and update on that effort.
And I would assume that's also an appeal for folks on this group, on this forum, to make sure that you're responsive to those requests for information and input from your state, whether it's in those one-on-one conversations from a policy perspective that AASHTO's offered, or if it's other surveys that we send out. We do appreciate and value that because it frames the discussion for us from a policy perspective. And then the last thing, Ed has said, quick short-term money generally creates overtime in the contracting industry, not necessarily full long-term jobs. And I think that was a lesson from the last stimulus, from the ARA package, in terms of how we spend money and what does that really translate to if we're seriously committed to creating jobs with this investment. So thank you, June, for that discussion. Thank you, everyone who contributed to that. And I will also advocate for a little bit more time in our next agenda to make sure that this dialogue can continue. And so out of a fairness of time, we've got a few minutes left for Kathy to come on and share some of her perspectives as well as it relates to reauthorization. And that might touch on that topic of stimulus versus reauthorization or a combined effort. Kathy?
Thanks, Dr. Wilson, and hello, everybody. And as was said earlier, I hope everyone who's dealing with the cold and the ice are doing okay. So the good thing about us needing to save on some time is I was asked to talk about the reauthorization process, and you're going to hear from Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves and EPW leadership, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and their staff in the next couple of days. So I'm going to cut my comments back quite a bit so that we can get to a couple of questions that we've teed up related to reauthorization, because it's your feedback that's really the most important. So just quickly, the House is beginning to hold some of their reauthorization hearings this week and will continue to do that. We expect to see some changes to HR 2, and the committee staff are working hard to get those changes ready for leadership to give the green light for their bill to go to the floor. I've been told that they're trying to get things wrapped up on their end in the next few weeks. Again, you'll hear from Garrett Graves on Thursday from the House T&I committee. But bottom line, given the narrow majority of the Democrats in the House, the chairman's really going to have to thread the needle on policy, and it's certainly been AASHTO's desire that we have the process as bipartisan as possible, which we know is not easy. And folks on both sides of the aisle would like to find a way to work together, and just know that we're trying to provide whatever leadership and help we can to the House T&I committee to try and bring folks together on a bill. Really, the most important newsworthy thing that's taken place is in the Senate. Victoria Sheehan, AASHTO's president, is going to be testifying tomorrow morning on behalf of AASHTO, along with Governors Whitmer, Hogan, and Denver Mayor Hancock. It's an excellent opportunity to highlight the work that all of you are doing every day, and certainly in this time of the ongoing pandemic. Recall that EPW passed their highway title in 2019, which I know seems like a lifetime ago, at least it does to me. That bill passed the committee unanimously, and Chairman Carper has stated publicly that he's going to use that bill as the basis for new legislation this year. So we expect to see some changes, and the chairman has stated that he'd like to see a more robust climate title. As part of that EPW reauthorization process, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito just on Friday sent a letter to all Senate offices seeking their policy priorities for the reauthorization bill. And that's something that you may start hearing from your delegation members about. Each office is asked to provide detailed descriptions for each policy request. And some offices, we've learned in the past, will want legislative language if you do sponsor any ideas. So be ready for that. The individual deadline, the deadline for individual Senate offices to submit their information back to the committee is March 19th. So we have just a few weeks for all of us to engage with the Senate. They're not looking for earmark requests at this time. So they did make a point of that. That's not to say that won't come at some point, but they did make a point of saying they're not looking for earmark requests. Let us know if you need any help or more information as you work with your delegation. And certainly let us know if you hear some priorities that members of Congress have that they're going to be pursuing that you think would be good for us to have a heads up. We've talked in the past about the policy issues that we expect to be part of the debate this year. They really haven't changed. So we're not going to go into any of them in any detail, but let me just highlight them for you because it's a couple of these areas that we really want to get your feedback on today. Climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, responding to extreme weather events and providing appropriate infrastructure resiliency, direct funding to local governments or increasing sub-allocations, the growing number of discretionary programs, a return of earmarks, as Susan mentioned, and we've had a good discussion on, technology issues such as broadband, EV charging, and other uses of the right-of-way. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, which seems to always be the elephant in the room, is how to pay for a reauthorization bill. including through the establishment of a national VMT system. CBO, some of you may have noticed, provided their recent projections showing that the Highway Trust Fund will need about $100 billion just to keep the program funding levels where they are through fiscal year 2027. So I know we hear a lot about trillions here and trillions there here in DC, but $100 billion is still a substantial number, and we want to keep trying to find a way to have Congress address this funding shortfall. We've heard again in the last few weeks that the appetite for a fuel tax just isn't there. There is talk about trying to accelerate a VMT system at the national level, but as all of you know who've worked in this area, it's very complicated and it's one that's going to take more time to develop. We're working with Congress to provide information on the issue, and certainly would want to rely on all of you that have state pilots in this area. Let me just say that having worked on several of these multi-year bills as a staffer on the EPW committee, I personally don't think it's going to be the policy differences between the House and Senate that will keep us from having a bill on time September 30th. It's still going to be a way to find a way to pay for it. So to get to the issue that came up, Dr. Wilson, it is certainly possible that reconciliation, this stimulus jobs reconciliation vehicle could provide funding and revenue for the Highway Trust Fund. That is certainly an option. And that's what's been done in the past. The last time the fuel tax was increased in 1993, that was also part of a reconciliation package. So that vehicle could certainly present itself as a way for us to get the funding to write a transportation bill then later in the year. I'm going to stop there, Mr. Chairman. We have teed up a couple of questions related to direct funding and discretionary programs. Those are kind of two thorny issues that we keep grappling with, and all of you are really the experts, and we'd love to get some feedback on your work with local governments and some ideas on how we might be able to structure discretionary grant programs in the future that make them not so onerous for all of you. So I'll stop there.
So thank you, Kathy. This is a great opportunity for us to have a discussion, and you set it up very well for us to spend the next 5 to 8 minutes talking about direct expenditures and, of course, discretionary. And I would just urge us all, as I do here, to not look at some of these challenges from a deficit perspective, but just identify the fact that if dollars aren't being spent for whatever reason, that they're not reaching their destination. And so let me get some feedback from, first we'll spend 1 or 2 minutes on the issue around direct allocations and what we could be doing and some best practices. I think Texas has presented some, and I know every state's working with MPOs. Any comments on how we're working with local governments as it relates to being able to respond to this direct allocation discussion? Surely someone's got some thoughts on how we could better manage and offer some solutions or best practices and how to make that happen.
Dr. Wilson, if I could jump in, one thing that may help the discussion, we know that suballocated funds tend to be those balances that grow, the unobligated balances that grow, but it's been really hard to put our fingers on what are all the reasons why that happens. And I think if we could articulate all of the reasons why local governments have a difficult time expending these funds, we could have that conversation then with Congress about increasing direct funding or increasing the suballocations and maybe try to get to some kind of solution.
No, absolutely. Any comments on that? Thank you, Kathy. And I'll also mention, we had this discussion internally here today about states' ability to sponsor some of these programs as well as an issue that we might want to address to help ensure that that unobligated balance isn't growing beyond perhaps the capacity of our local partners. Any feedback or comment on that?
Hey, Sean, Patrick McKenna here. I think it's a good point, but maybe we're going about it differently. I think if actually suballocated funds weren't necessarily designated against state DOT's obligated balances, maybe we just separate the issue out so that, it's not if there's a desire for more direct funding and allocation, I think that to the extent that it's viewed as sustainable over time, I think you'll find that local governments will
build the capacity to work through those issues in cooperation and coordination with the state DOT. But if Congress has a window into really where the obligational balances are, separated out, as simple as just dividing out the W-10A form and reporting that's done, so that we all have a good sense of that difference. Then state DOTs can do more to manage their own allocated funds, and certainly then the questions regarding the obligational balances in the other accounts could be better addressed, I think, by others. And then it's not as much of a concern for a state DOT, and maybe that's where some of the resistance to the direct allocation occurs. But I think you have to work in partnership with your local partners to look at the system overall and see where the needs are, and work together to find those differences. But I think if we separate those out a little bit from a reporting structure, it'll be more clear to Congress, and then it'll take a little pressure off state DOTs when we're looking at overall obligation limitations.
Thank you, Patrick. Well spoken as our immediate past president. Let's go to Mark Williams right quick before we take some questions or comments about discretionary funding. Mark?
Sure. Just maybe a quick idea, Sean, that I leave it up to AASHTO to maybe explore this or others to weigh in. But at what point, if Congress continues to look at direct allocations locally and increasing the percentage of the STP MM allocations that are going to the local entities, at what point could the carryover of obligation authority in these areas hit potentially a trigger where Congress would agree that, yeah, if they are carrying over 200% of their annual allocation in this particular category, then the state would have the ability to reallocate those funds to other areas. Because I don't know that we're going to, other than cajoling and continuing to work with the MPOs, and I won't rehash that was a good conversation between Ashby Johnson and our Austin MPO director and James Bass back in the fall about how we are trying to work together. I think some of it's just the nature of the beast of how the local MPOs have to go about their decision-making process with local entities, and that takes time, and that ends up resulting in large unobligated balances in some of these categories that are a challenge for the states to manage.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Mark. Let's switch over. And again, use the chat, folks, or raise your hand if you have questions. Matt's doing a great job of identifying next up for me. We've got a few minutes left on this section, and we might be able to shave off an extra minute or two in the next section. Let's talk a little bit about discretionary funding. I know it's a big issue. We've had consistently, from AASHTO's perspective, advocated that 90% of federal funding be distributed via formula. Any comments or concerns about new programs or new discretionary programs that might be an offshoot or offspring of reauthorization that folks would like to comment on? Concerns or issues, best practices, challenges, things you would like to see if they were to move toward some additional discretionary programs other than those that we see? I know one question that I've had from one secretary is the frequency of the changes, not really frequency, but the policy initiatives that are changing. I don't suspect that they're going to change annually, but they don't really provide a lot of time on occasion when they create those. So clearly that's one issue to be considered of. Any others?
If I could add, yeah, I think part of the reason this keeps coming up is that, we continue to press for as much of the highway trust fund dollars, especially from contract authority, go towards the formula programs, and the 92% of the FASTAC highway formula dollar or highway trust fund dollars by formula. We're trying to keep as much of that as possible, but we also recognize a lot of new priorities that are being talked about, and a lot of those new priorities being translated into discretionary grant programs. And we have been wondering, look, if some of them have to happen, really, frankly. Is there a better way to put it together? Are there some lessons learned from your experience too in applying for administering infra and build grants over the past decade at this point that started out as the Tiger grants, right? Are there some best practices that can help to inform, some of the discretionary grant programs that Congress really wants to get done this year?
Don't forget, raise your hand if you'd like to respond or make a comment based on what June has just said or others, particularly on this discussion around discretionary grants, something we're all interested in and we all compete with, and represent opinions and ideas of local governments that we hear in our states. What are their challenges? How are they making match? How are they delivering the project? Any comments that folks would like to share?
Dr. Wilson, this is Nick Donahue from Virginia.
Hey, Nick, how are you?
I'm doing well. And sorry, I can't find the hand raise thing, so that's why I just kind of keep.
If you just raise it at your desk, I'll call on you. Nick Donahue just raised his hand.
I saw some other people had the little hand thing in their box, so yeah, I can't seem to find it. My apologies. So I personally believe there is a need for discretionary programs. I think there are just going to be large, sometimes multi-billion-dollar projects that are results, that need to be funded, and they may not be a result of just travel within one state. So people do cross state boundaries, and that creates impacts on our transportation systems. And, if well designed, these discretionary programs can help us address projects like that. I think one of the items that I think would be helpful, and I think the House bill last year sought to get at this, though I don't know, if the language was right or not, but it's just some sort of, feedback on how you did or didn't meet the criteria they were looking for. So, I think we had an okay sense of that in past administrations. I would say in the last one, we didn't always get the feedback about why we weren't selected or, how our project did or didn't meet some of the criteria that folks were looking for. And so just making sure we kind of understand how we're going to be judged and how the selection process works. And, I understand it's not going to be 100% quantitative because there's some things you can't, that are just going to be qualitative in the decision-making process, but just providing more insight and feedback as the process plays out to allow us to be able to understand that and respond accordingly as we see appropriate, I think would be really helpful.
Thank you, Nick. And just as an FYI for folks, if you go to the reactions button on your screen, you should see several emojis, thumbs up, raise your hand, yes, no for votes, the whole bit. So if you would go there, you can find that. And then I guess in response to that, what I would suggest is if you've never taken advantage of the debrief that's offered, I mean, it's usually a very overprescribed competitive program where they may get 300 or 400 applications and a handful of them get funded. Certainly everybody's not going to go get that debrief, but for meaningful projects, debriefs are super, super important and add value. I've taken advantage of it and I would urge you to do it. We get on that roller coaster wheel and just keep grinding when we don't get rejected or get rejected or don't get accepted. Pick up the phone and have that conversation and lean forward to get it. And so two things, and then this will be our last comment. One, Nancy has said discretionary grant funding for climate mitigation and resilience. Criteria should prioritize efforts that support our most vulnerable communities. And again, it's limiting the priorities, I think is what she's saying, and focusing on real solutions or real areas where we have concerns. Let's go to Ed Hetzinger, and then we will transition to the next topic. Ed?
Yeah, I think something we've found to be valuable is we've been working on for the past several years an unfunded project-specific list that's probably 4 times as big as our yearly program. And we've done that in conjunction with our RPCs and our MPOs so that when we get, whether it's stimulus, discretionary grant program, or just, more routine money, we've already got a vetted list of projects that we can use to fit whatever program or discretionary grant program comes out. And we don't really have to go back and get, is this a priority? And the MPOs fall in with us on it. And it just makes things easier. And it's been pretty useful in all these programs.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. And Sandra also made it a point to say the debrief is helpful if your project is not ranked high. But if it is and it goes to the secretary, which is a good number of them, it may not necessarily give you any additional information other than that. And so, again, knowing and being transparent about which ones are accepted and not, or how they're ranked, is something that's there. So lots of other comments there in this section. In fairness to the agenda and those who prepared, I think I'll make an executive decision to move on. We've kind of stolen 5 minutes from the AASHTO Electric Vehicle Working Group. So why don't we put a pin in this discussion, and I'll defer and refer to online discussions as it relates to communicating questions to June or to the policy forum for issues that you might have from everyone else and other topics that we get. So please use that as a resource. So at this time, what we'd like to do is transition, and we'll hear an update from the EV working group at AASHTO. And to kick off this discussion, it's going to be a multidisciplinary effort, and we'd like to ask King G to first provide a brief overview of what's been the group's discussions thus far. And then he'll introduce Nancy Daubenberger. I think I said that right, Nancy, and if not, I apologize. Nancy is the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Engineer at MnDOT, Minnesota Department of Transportation, to present on the progress made with the EV working group thus far. And as we talked about in the earlier part of this discussion on surface transportation, reauthorization, the input from this group will be absolutely crucial in identifying what policy positions that AASHTO will take. So let's turn it over to King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I like to do is give you some background and context for the emerging mobility areas, one of which is the electric vehicle area that Nancy is going to touch on. As you all know, transportation technology has always been evolving. But with the advent of digital technology and artificial intelligence, the developments in the transportation area has just ramped up tremendously, both in terms of investments and technological developments. So that we see a lot of work going on in connected vehicles, automated vehicles, electric vehicles, drones, shared mobility and mobility on demand, and that whole broad range of technologies and concepts. And one reality is that these technologies and concepts are disruptive and even transformative of transportation as we know it. So when you think about these emerging mobility areas, there are many, many differences, but there are some parallels as well. The promise and the hype that's swirling in the media brings a lot of confusion as to what is real and what is not yet real. Another parallel is that the time to maturity and the deployment pathway is very, very uncertain. And all of them involve non-traditional stakeholders and new partners to AASHTO and the state DOTs. And lastly, the issues and the policy matters that are involved in all of these emerging mobility areas cut across the traditional councils and committees of AASHTO. So it's important to have coordination among all of the committees and councils that are involved in a given area and to engage the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders, ultimately to ensure that these new technologies are deployed efficiently and safely for transportation purposes. The Strategic Management Committee endorsed the concept of intercommittee working groups last year. And you may remember that the Strategic Management Committee is a subgroup of the Board of Directors that was added with the reorganization of the committees in 2016 to provide some top-down direction as well as a traditional bottoms-up direction that the committees have always been working under. And the emerging mobility areas are certainly areas that deserve and warrant some top-down direction. So there are 4 intercommittee working groups. The first one is Connected and Automated Vehicles. The sponsor is Scott Malla, Director of the Iowa Department of Transportation, who chairs the Committee on Transportation System Operations. And the convener is Tony Cradlefield. The next one is Unmanned Aerial Systems and Urban Air Mobility. The sponsor is Julie Lorenz, Secretary of the Kansas DOT, who chairs the Council on Aviation. And the convener is Bobby Walston from North Carolina.
The third one is shared mobility, mobility as a service, mobility on demand. And the sponsor is Roger Millard, Secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation, who chairs the Council on Public Transportation. And the convener is Brian Lagerberg from Washington State. Lastly, the electric vehicle working group is sponsored by Russell McMurray, Commissioner of the Georgia DOT, who chairs the Council on Highways and Streets. And the convener is Nancy Daubenberger from Minnesota. So when you look at these four areas, you can certainly say that there's a common thread because they all involve transportation. However, because each of the areas is being progressed differently by different stakeholders, it is logical to separate them at this point. But we know for sure that the issues and the policies will overlap and may need to converge at some point in the future. But for now, that's how it's being organized. So when the four working groups were put together, there was a common set of purposes and objectives. First, it was to provide timely information to CEOs on these emerging areas. And this will be in the form of a flyer that will provide an easy read, quick read, that will be updated periodically. Second is to clarify the issues and options for state DOTs on these emerging areas. And this will continue to be some areas that we monitor and provide updates and curated information for the state DOTs. But ultimately, it is really to facilitate and enable a timely engagement of AASHTO and the state DOTs on the issues and policies in each of the four emerging mobility areas. And as you look through the sub-elements there, the last one in terms of developing policy positions is exactly what Nancy is going to be pointing to when she talks about the EV working group. If you're visual, this is a representation of the cooperating committees very quickly on which ones are involved. So in connected and automated vehicles, the Transportation System Operations Committee is the convener, and the other red dash circled committees are the cooperating committees. For UAS, UAM, or drones, again, aviation and the corresponding cooperating committees. And then for shared mobility, MOD, again, under public transportation and the cooperating committees there. Lastly, for electric vehicles, the convener, again, is Nancy Daubenberger under the Highways and Streets Council with their convening and cooperating committees. So that's very quick overview of the context for the electric vehicle intercommittee working group. Are there any questions before we turn the time over to Nancy?
Any questions? Feel free again to raise your hands. Any questions for King before we get Nancy's presentation and discussion? All right. Thank you, King. Seeing none, Nancy, we'll go to you for a second.
Let me just give some more introduction for Nancy.
Okay.
Nancy is, as the chair noted, is a deputy commissioner and chief engineer of the Minnesota DOT. She's a veteran of MnDOT and has served in different management positions, including the oversight of the engineering services group and as a state bridge engineer. She is an active member of the Council on Highways and Streets and TPF. Nancy is a native of Minnesota, having received engineering degrees, civil engineering degrees from North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota. So I'm pleased to turn the time over now to Nancy. Nancy?
Thank you, King. And just a quick technology check. Can you hear me okay and see my video?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, again, I'm Nancy Daubenberger, and I'm the convener of the AASHTO Electric Vehicle Intercommittee Working Group. And as King mentioned too, our working group certainly appreciates the support of Commissioner Russell McMurray from Georgia as our sponsor. And I just really appreciate you allowing me some time on the agenda today so I could provide an update on this particular working group and a brief summary of our activities and next steps. And an overview of the discussions our group has been having about AASHTO electrification policy. So that's why we wanted to bring it here today to the TPF. So our working group is part of the effort that King just mentioned, and our charge is to identify and prioritize issues under the EV umbrella to help AASHTO address opportunities as well as challenges associated with electrification. The working group has done some work already, and we met 4 times over the last several months. We're starting to develop the white papers. The primary goal of those meetings has been to learn more about the current state of play and develop a plan for writing these white papers and a CEO flyer for covering electrification. So truly an intercommittee working group, have representation from the following AASHTO committees and councils. I mentioned Commissioner Russell McMurray, who's the chair of the Council on Highways and Streets, as our sponsor. And I'm part of CHS as well as the convener of this particular working group. The Council on Public Transportation, the Committee on Transportation Systems Operations, the Committee on Funding and Finance, Committee on Rights of Way and Utilities, Committee on Environment and Sustainability, and the Committee on Planning. So as our work evolves, we plan to reach out to other AASHTO committees as needed too, for their review and input, and have guest speakers to cover additional electrification issues to help inform our white papers. And as I mentioned, we're in the process of authoring these 4 white papers, and I'll just mention real briefly the topics they're going to cover. So one that emerged pretty quickly as we started having discussions was around what is the role of state DOTs, and that white paper will discuss the role that DOTs play in accommodating and preparing for EVs as we transition to them, but it'll also cover state DOTs' experience in helping to educate the public about EVs and addressing the increasing need for charging stations and exploring DOT utilization of public right-of-way and other DOT facilities, such as rest areas, to accommodate EVs, including support for multimodal and active transportation options, such as electric buses and e-vehicles, or e-bicycles, excuse me. Another topic is potential infrastructure needs, challenges, and opportunities. So this white paper will examine electricity distribution challenges and opportunities for state DOTs, and we'll explore potential strategies and best practices for partnering with our stakeholders on installation, operation, and maintenance of EV infrastructure. So some big challenges ahead for us, but sounds like what we can work through. That paper will address those topics. And then the third is funding and revenue issues and implications. So much of what's been discussed already today, but this paper will explore revenue implications from an increase in EV adoption and look at potential solutions like the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, or other types of road user charges, registration fees, alternative taxation scenarios. And then the fourth will address transit electrification. So this would be the state DOT role in transit, and when it comes to electrification, and be examined along with potential infrastructure needs and challenges and opportunities, of course, as well as the upfront investment costs for transit electrification. And then also, very importantly, so those are the 4 papers, but our plan is to incorporate an equity framework into all of these papers. So specifically, we want to examine how a state DOT can ensure equitable distribution of both the benefits as well as the burdens of transportation, electrification, and those investments. So we're focused on learning more about the new administration's priorities around electrification. And in fact, the Biden administration has announced the shift of federal fleet to electric, and we expect to see a focus on electrification as work begins on Capitol Hill regarding reauthorization. So as we've been a part of, the TPF has done a lot of work, of course, around preparing AASHTO's response and recommendations regarding reauthorization, because we were just talking about that earlier. And our working group has reviewed current AASHTO policy, looked at the committee and council white papers that have been developed in 2018, and currently AASHTO does not have specific policy provisions related to electrification. So language we've seen thus far in HR 2, the Moving Forward Act, includes provisions to provide discretionary grant funding to support the development of an electric vehicle charging network, and to encourage greening the fleet through tax credits for zero-emission vehicle purchases, supporting zero-emission vehicle manufacturing, and development of a publicly accessible vehicle charging infrastructure, including underserved communities. We expect the administration to have additional proposals supporting EV adoption and building out the EV changing network. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the EV working group sees this as an opportunity for AASHTO to consider a potential resolution about electrification. So we do plan to come back to the AASHTO spring meeting with proposals to be considered by the TPF and the board of directors for inclusion in continuing reauthorization discussions. And as we begin the process, we'd benefit from any input that TPF might like to offer. Thus, if anyone has any input to provide to us that you haven't already through other channels to get to the working group, either today at the end of this here discussion, or just getting in touch with us by emailing myself or Jim McDonald with AASHTO, we are very open to input. So again, thank you for your time. We look forward to talking more about this at the AASHTO spring meeting, but welcome any questions or input that you'd have for us right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. For folks who are in the Zoom room here that are members of the forum, any questions for Nancy or King that you'd like to point out? We've got a couple of minutes before we move on to our final topic for today's meeting, but we want to recognize that we are sharing those as they come up. Both Matt, who's doing a great job of monitoring what's happening on the YouTube, as well as we're watching the Zoom chat. Question from Sandra, are you coordinating at all with the U.S. Climate Alliance and Transportation Working Group, Nancy?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, the U.S. Climate Alliance Transportation Working Group has not been a part of our discussions, but I know we've got some connections there, and maybe I'll turn it over to King or anyone from AASHTO if they want to mention any connections they've made with the Climate Alliance Transportation Working Group.
King?
We've begun to have some outreach, but the original impetus for these intercommittee working groups was really to be internal coordination, but it's been very clear that external groups very, very much want to engage with these working groups. So we will follow up with that.
Good idea. And I would suspect we probably have some members, King, who are members of both entities and working groups. So that cross-fertilization, I'm sure, can occur very easy. Any other questions on this issue of electric vehicles and what the working group is working on for AASHTO? Have you engaged with anyone at Caltrans on the EV charging? That's from Nicole Longoria.
Thank you for that question. We will reach out to Caltrans on that, on the EV charging. I'm trying to recall offhand if we've engaged someone on that particular topic white paper, but thank you for that comment. We'll make sure that we are reaching out to them if we haven't gotten any input already.
Well, and for those who are, she says thank you, and for those who are paying attention to this issue, you know, this was somewhat covered in the COVID relief bill with some special allocation. So I think the administration, as you said, are leaning forward in trying to solidify this as a policy alternative for our country. So thank you for what you're doing, King, and Nancy with the working group. So awesome. We are only about 3 minutes over. I think we've done a good job in terms of keeping up with our schedule. Our last segment is going to be discussion led by Jim Timon, our executive director, and Scott Pankratz with the Adventure Cycling Association. And it's to really provide an overview of an MOU between AASHTO and the AACA, as it's called, regarding the bicycle routing system. So let's ask Jim to open this segment up, and he will then turn it over to Scott, I believe.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson. As you mentioned, one of the items that we wanted to cover today as part of this meeting's agenda is just to have a short ceremony to formalize and solidify the relationship that AASHTO has had for well over a decade with the Adventure Cycling Association. And I'd like to welcome the Executive Director of the Adventure Cycling Association, Scott Pankratz, to our meeting today. As some of you may know, AASHTO and ACA and several other organizations came together in the mid-2000s to look into reinvigorating an effort that began in the 1970s, and that's the effort to designate a cross-country long-distance system of bicycle routes, similar to the interstate highway system. And that route would really be designed to provide for and encourage long-distance bicycle riding and the associated benefits to tourism and economic development that brings. So this reinvigoration effort resulted in the development of a national corridor plan and overarching principles to be used by state DOTs in designating U.S. bicycle routes that cross the country and reach nearly every state in the union. In 2008, the AASHTO Board of Directors officially adopted the corridor plan, and AASHTO and ACA have been working with state DOTs to identify routes to include in this system since then. So with that, let me hand it over to Scott to provide some remarks and some additional background on the U.S. bicycle route system and our work together. Scott?
Great, thanks so much, Jim. Great to be here. Thanks for having me today. This MOU is a really exciting marker on this long-standing relationship between Adventure Cycling and AASHTO, as Jim mentioned. We've been working together since 2005 to bring together the U.S. bicycle route system in service to seamless bicycle travel around and across the country. The national bicycle infrastructure is more important now than ever, as we see a surge in sales and interest in cycling and a need to get out safely during the pandemic. And I think this has been a really rewarding effort to be a part of in these times in particular. Working together, we plan to and hope to designate and sign the largest bicycle route system in the world at over 50,000 miles. And I wanted to share just a short video with you all to kind of give you a taste of what the U.S. bike route system is and can be.
Roads connect us. They're our lifeline to our neighbors next door, our friends across town, and people across the country. The U.S. bicycle route system will connect the people, places, and all the things we love by bicycle, providing an official nationwide network of signed bicycle routes across the U.S. using roads and trails. Imagine being able to easily navigate your way by bike to visit a friend in the next town, or ride your bike from coast to coast by following an official interstate system of bicycle routes. The USBRS is about connecting communities, supporting businesses in small towns, creating a healthier future, and linking together our iconic landscapes. U.S. bike routes are already underway as people in communities are realizing the benefits of bicycling. Whether you're only riding across town or across the country, be part of the movement. Build it, bike it, be a part of it. Learn more and get involved at adventurecycling.org/USBRS.
So as I mentioned, this plan has been honed, and the end goal vision is a 50,000-mile network for cyclists to experience the people and communities of our country at an up-close and personal level. This is the National Corridor Plan. It shows where the U.S. bike route system is headed and is a blueprint for future development. The solid black lines on this graphic represent designated USBRs, and the colored dashed lines represent the plan for the system and corridors that connect the states. State DOTs have the ultimate authority in determining where their routes go, though they must have concurrence from adjoining states when a U.S. bike route ends or begins at a state line. The corridors connect rural and urban areas to and through key travel destinations. And after 15 years of active engagement and collaboration with DOTs, including route research, work with local municipalities and non-state-owned facilities, and sharing the news with our 53,000 members, it's really exciting to see the momentum building and the network about to tip over the 15,000-mile mark. I did want to take a moment just to mention the progress wouldn't be possible without the dedicated work and strong support of Adventure Cycling staff members, in particular, Sarah Snow and Jen Hamilman, and our former Director of Advocacy, Jenny Sullivan. Dedicated volunteers and advocacy partners, including Carrie Irons, the Virginia DOT, original instigator of the concept for the US BRS in 1978, Michigan DOT, who set the new standard for process and success with volunteers and the work of Josh DeBrine, and the staff at AASHTO. It's been great to work in particular with Matt Hardy, Jim McDonnell, and Jim Timon. Wanted to show just a couple pictures from the network. From a map to reality, from ideas to impact, here's a few scenes from around the US BRS. This work fundamentally changes people and communities. It brings health, tourism, and self-discovery. The US BRS brings us together, and these lines on the map connect us. The US BRS is intended for long-distance traveling cyclists, but it also benefits cyclists of all ages and abilities in their home communities by increasing awareness, safety, and building economic benefits. And this work directly links the state DOTs dedicated to signage, safety, and transit to the people traveling on their bicycles, to communities and tourist destinations like the Paul Bunyan Trail in Minnesota, and this beautiful covered bridge at the entrance to Frankenmuth, Michigan's Little Bavaria. These routes take us to new places, learning, adventure, and new friends. As one of our staff member, Lori, often comments, if you want to restore your faith in humanity, go on a bike tour. Jim?
Well, thanks, Scott. I mean, and as everybody has seen, really this partnership with Adventure Cycling has been a huge benefit to this program, and ACA has been instrumental in the implementation of the U.S. bicycle route system, helping to educate state DOTs on their options, coordinating with the different jurisdictions that the routes run through, documenting the continual expanding extent of the system, developing maps and promotional materials for the effort, and really just doing that groundwork that's needed to get these routes identified, designated, and publicized within the bicycling community. And, and this effort really would never have gotten to where it is right now without their leadership and their initiative in driving this effort. We're really excited to have this MOU document those roles and responsibilities that each organization has been playing and maintaining and updating both the National Corridor Plan, as you saw on an earlier slide, with involvement of our Committee on Planning and the designation of specific routes through the AASHTO Special Committee on U.S. Route Numbering. This MOU is important, I think, for both organizations. It certainly highlights AASHTO's longstanding commitment to advancing a multimodal vision for America. And each new bike route really does give people more travel options to connect with neighboring communities and recreational facilities and tourism. So, we're really excited about this. And with that, I think we can move on to the actual signing of the document.
My copy here, see if this works.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. I'm not sure we got that right, but
no, we almost did. But it was pretty good still.
You handed it the wrong way, Scott.
I'm sorry.
I think I grabbed it the wrong way. It was my responsibility to grab it from the right document. But here we do. We do have it signed document right here. Welcome to virtual MOU signing 101. We'll keep working on this until we get it right. But thank you, Scott, for joining us today. Really important for us as an organization, and I know it's important to you. We had a great pre-meeting on Friday where we talked a little bit about some of those pictures that you showed in that slide, and to hear some of the AASHTO staff talk about actually having been on some of those routes that you showed. I think it just shows that the system is really coming to fruition, and it's being utilized, and it's only going to grow here in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. This really sets the stage for the next phase in our growth. And I also want to just extend a sincere thank you to each of you, our amazing DOT partners and community members. And also, if you'd like to learn more we're here to support you. If you want to go for a ride, that's easy. We can help out with that. And also, we look forward to your help in building the United States bicycle route system. So thank you again for having us here and for the support of AASHTO. Thank you, Jim.
And thank you, Scott, and thank you to the whole adventure cycling team. We really do look forward to continuing our longstanding relationship with Adventure Cycling Association, and we encourage our member departments, our state DOTs that haven't yet explored this opportunity to reach out and get in touch to get this process started.
Please do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Scott, both for this. We all participated in our first virtual MOU signing. I did a virtual groundbreaking and ribbon cutting. So this COVID environment is really leaving its mark on us, right? The only comment I would make, Jim, is let's make sure that we share with states how they can participate and engage in this, because I know most of our states all have pretty robust bicycle routes themselves, and creating a pretty good network in that active transportation world in terms of how folks can communicate and how we can advance some of those efforts to really put some weight behind this MOU, I think will be very, very helpful. And clearly, where we've been in the pandemic, the idea that we saw more people riding, and it's unfortunately going to reflect, I think, our safety numbers around the country in terms of what we saw. The signage and the safety factor of what we're doing is super important. And so targeting that conversation at the state level is super, super, as I said, I'm repeating myself, but clearly there's an opportunity to deal in both urban and rural settings, as well as those flat settings. And as a Scoutmaster, I don't mind riding bikes, or a former Scoutmaster, I'll stay off the hills, Scott. So it's a lot easier to ride in Louisiana than look for those mountains. So thank you for that. Any other comments or closing questions for Scott or Jim regarding the MOU? As Matt says, once a Scoutmaster, always a Scoutmaster. And I remember, I think we were in Wyoming and we actually did a bike ride, if I'm remembering correct, Matt, with Paul Trombino may have led that effort. So thank you all for that. I see no questions for this partnership. And Jim, thank you for making sure that we highlight all aspects of transportation that AASHTO is involved in, particularly at this forum, because we're going to address policy implications of what we do. And this is an example of taking the next step and really walking the walk we talk about. So with that said, we're at 1:56 my time, 2:56 your time, and maybe even 12:56 or 11:56 someone else's time. I'd like to thank you all for joining us from the committee, and for those who are viewing us on YouTube. This is a new experience for AASHTO, and we're excited to do it. You should know that we are just getting started with our 2021 AASHTO virtual briefing. For those of you who may not remember, I think the virtual briefing last year was right on the precipice of what we are dealing with in terms of our COVID response. And so there was tremendous engagement then, and we'd like you to stick around for our next session, which is the meeting of the AASHTO Committee on Funding and Finance. It's going to begin at 3:15 Eastern Standard Time. The TPF, our Transportation Policy Forum, will gather at our next monthly meeting, which is scheduled for Thursday, March 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are going to try to honor our on-time start and on-time finish like every other transportation project, so we can continue to have really good turnout for that. Let me encourage you to enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you at day 2 for the Washington briefing. It starts at 11 a.m. Eastern tomorrow at the Council on Rail Transportation. And remember, please check your email. Some of these events you have to have specific links to, and make sure you're up to date on what you need to do, and encourage all your peers to participate in our Washington briefing virtually. This is a huge opportunity, and I think we even saw that we had more people sign up for this virtually than we did in person last year. So thank you to the staff for putting this together, and thank all of you members for participating. And you get 2 minutes extra to prepare for the break and the next meeting that's starting shortly. So thank you all for joining us.